Hi, my name is Paul Sargent, and today we're going to go through an old PowerPoint about the Constitution and walk you through sort of a little bit of the background stuff that you might need to know for the AP exam about the Constitution. So this is called Setting the Stage. All right, now if you see here, this is what we would call general disorder here. You've got all kinds of people that are looking around and keeping an eye on what's going on here, and you obviously have someone who's not really obeying the law. And this is from a thing called Shays' Rebellion, which is going to end up showing the weaknesses with what the government, the people come up with that leads to the Constitution. And it's not really what you want, when you have people who are openly defying and stopping courts from going through and being able to do what it is they're trying to do. And carry out their jobs. So here's a little background, okay? So this is the British contribution. Now, this is just sort of the reality of it, that our institutions, our society is all based on a British model. And so here's some of the precedents that lead up to what we have. Number one, we have what's called Magna Carta. This is really signed in 1215. This is the first document that actually puts limitations on the British monarchy. And there are a couple of major things: that people had to have trial by jury available to them, couldn't just be convicted for no reason, and that they couldn't arbitrarily take life, liberty, or property. Now, these three things are going to become pretty important here. And that kind of sets the basis for the idea that monarchs have to pay attention to the law, and that kings have to respect the rights of individuals, and those rights have to be guaranteed. Well, you go about 400 years before the British decide to make another real major change to it, and this happens under the Petition of Right. Now, Charles I, the Stuart monarch, who was having a clash with Parliament, is sort of forced into signing this Petition of Right, and what it says is this. Again, it reinforces the trial by jury idea, and it backs up the idea that when we're in peacetime, there shouldn't be any martial law. Now, in case you don't understand what that martial law is a time in which the military kind of takes over. They set up as the government. Most individual rights and the normal way and procedures that things would be done are thrown out because there's some perceived threat. And then they also say that you can't quarter troops in people's homes. In other words, if you're going to have an army, king, you got to give them a camp, and they have to live there. They can't just live in the homes of the people and live off the people and all of that. Well, after a long civil war, a restoration, and then what's called the Glorious Revolution, and the history of this you don't really need to know, but feel free to look it up. In 1688, William and Mary, who are crowned as King and Queen of England, are asked to sign the English Bill of Rights. That's part of the deal. Like, if you sign this, then you become King and Queen. Great. Again, we back up the no standing army in peacetime. Wait a minute, we don't back that up. That's new. That you don't have an army that's just kind of hanging around with nothing to do. Parliamentary elections, where they elect the legislature, should be free. People should be able to elect whoever they want. People have the right to a fair and speedy trial. Can't be held in jail for a long period of time. And there's going to be no excessive bail or cruel punishment. Now, taken all together, you can see that this is kind of the basis that provides us with what we have as some of our basic rights here in the United States. Now, if we look at the colonial experience, we're sort of talking early colonial days here, and it's important to know this because it sets, again, the stage for what's going on. The government early on, the British government, really kind of left everything in the colonies to the people. The colonial governments were there in order to sort of make the laws and oversee all of this. And the king and parliament oversaw foreign policy, trade, kind of like big issues like that. But they basically otherwise left the colonies alone. Well, the French and Indian War, or as the rest of the world calls it, the 7 Years' War, was sort of the thing that changed everything. When it ended in 1763, the British realized they had taken on an enormous amount of debt in order to fight this war, a large part of which was fought on the American continent to defend the colonies against the French and their Indian allies on the frontier. And so Parliament decides after the war that they're going to charge the colonists taxes in order to pay not only for the money that it cost to wage the war, but the continuing defense of the new territory that they gained after the war. And so, this doesn't go over well. People don't like to be taxed. But they also start enforcing trade regulations, and these had been in effect for a very, very long time, but they hadn't really been enforced in any real way. A lot of this had to do with how colonists could get goods. Most goods had to be transported from their origin. If they're being imported to the colonies, they had to be transported from their origin. Maybe like Haiti or something like that, right? Or sugar from the islands in the Caribbean. Then they had to go to an English port in England where they would pay a tax, and then they could go to the colonies. Now, not only is this a longer and slower process, but it makes them more expensive because it's longer and slower, and you have to pay taxes in England. And Americans really didn't like this. They were really kind of unhappy here. And they go in and they say, hey, what about this, what about representation? We're being taxed. We have no say in it. And you should be familiar with the phrase, no taxation without representation. And the British government comes out and they say this. They say, you guys have what's called virtual representation. And that's that the job of Parliament is to represent the English people. And so they represent all the interests of the English people, not just the interests of the people in the area they live, but all of them, and therefore they represent you. And while there are no colonists in Parliament, you are virtually represented. And Americans did not really think this was such a good idea. They kind of thought, I don't like this. This is a bad idea right here. And so they call together different things. The First Continental Congress meets in 1774. They talk about some sort of organization, but they don't really. Along comes independence. And again, we're skimming over some American history here, but this gives you the big idea. In July 2nd of 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopts the resolution that's put forth by a guy named Richard Henry Lee from Virginia, and that declares independence from Britain. Ironically, this is the date that John Adams always thought we should celebrate. July 2nd, we declared our independence. That's it. But the date that we actually celebrate is July 4th. It's nice and easy. It's on a piece of paper. It's on this Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence, which was adopted on July 4th after a couple of days of editing and debating and stuff like that, is the document that it's the foundation of the United States. It proclaimed the reasons why we broke from Britain. And of course, that brings in some big ideas about what government is and what government should do. And it was all done right here at the what we now call Independence Hall in Philadelphia. You can go there and you can visit it and you can walk in. They've got a nice little presentation that they do over in the back. You walk around, you go in the door here, but this is the main room where everything happened. And that's where they're going to sit down and not only debate and adopt the Declaration of Independence, but they're later going to go back there and debate and adopt the Constitution. So that's an important room. If you can make it to Philadelphia, do so. By the way, piece of advice, it can get really crowded in there, but January and February are the lowest attendance months. So in those 2 months, you don't have to get tickets. Tickets are free anyway, but you can just walk right in January and February. Highly recommend. That's the time to go see it. All right? So yes, here we are. They're signing the Declaration of Independence. Everyone looks happy. There's Jefferson right there in the middle presenting it, and we're going to do it. And here's what it looks like. The unanimous declaration of these people. And of course, right here is the very famous large John Hancock signature, and the signatures of all the delegates. So to get an understanding of what's in the Constitution, we kind of have to go back and look at some of the philosophical foundations of it. And there are really a couple of major writers that we're going to talk about. The first is a guy named Thomas Hobbes, who wrote a book called The Leviathan during the English Civil War. And in The Leviathan, he looked back to try and theorize about government, the nature of people, and what government should do. And he wrote the belief that in a state of nature, people are naturally selfish, that they do things which are in their own interests. And he said life in the state of nature is, and here it is, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This is not exactly the place where we'd like to live because, like, yeah, that's your life. You live alone, you don't have a lot of stuff, it's not good, it's violent, and you die early. And it's that fear. It's really the fear of violence and death that made people in the past come together and give power to an absolute monarch. And that absolute monarch does two things. Number one, he imposes order, and number two, he demands complete obedience. And in the ideas of Thomas Hobbes, we should give that to them. The people don't have the right to question the authority of a king, because a strong king makes for a strong country, and you got to let them do that. All right, and so it's people are just simply unable to govern themselves, and that's why we need this sort of thing. So he's big on like kings because people are bad. And then along comes John Locke, and John Locke writes his treatise, which is sort of a justification of the Glorious Revolution, where the English Bill of Rights came along, and writes some different ideas. These are going to sound maybe a little bit more familiar to us. People, he said, existed in a state of nature prior to government, and there were those laws of nature that governed their lives. Well, what were they? These are what are called natural laws, laws that are given to us, he said, by God. And natural law leads to some natural rights. He lists 3 of them, and here they are: life, liberty, and property. On the AP exam, they will ask you to know those: life, liberty, and property. Sounds a little familiar? Maybe we're foreshadowing. He also puts forth the idea that this is above human law, that the natural laws are from God, human laws made by humans, God's superior to humans, therefore, right? And so if you have a tyrant, if you have a ruler who really doesn't uphold their job, and they don't take care of the people, they rule tyrannically, meanly, then people have a right to challenge their rule. And he bases it on the idea of the consent of the governed, or what we come to call the social contract. That we have to give our consent to what's being done. He calls for limited government, that there have to be restrictions on power. And he says, really, government exists to protect these natural rights. Protect natural rights. It's big. Here's the right to revolt right here. If the government doesn't have their consent, people can revolt. So where is this going to go? Well, we're going to get to that in the next one. I don't want these screencasts to be too long, so I'm going to stop that here. So that's the first part of our look at the basis of the Constitution. My name's Paul Sargent, and thanks for watching.